India overnight. He accused China of bullying its neighbours and said we've probably put too many eggs into our China basket and we should trade more with India instead. Well, joining me is the panel, Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching and Liberal Senator James Paterson. James, you just got banned from visiting China because you dared to criticise its human rights abuses. Now, do you agree with Tony Abbott that we should be so dependent on business with this dictatorship? We must push harder to develop trade with democracies like India instead. Presumably, I'm reading the message into this, that we aren't so hostage to what China tells us.
I do agree with Tony Abbott, Andrew. I think that there's lots of good reasons why trade with India and other like-minded democracies is in Australia's interest. Trade with them is good in its own right, and it's also good if it helps us reduce our reliance on any one trading partner, China included. And yes, the geopolitical nature of our relationship with China is one of the factors that makes me have that view. And so a free trade agreement with India would be a wonderful thing. It's something that's been talked about in India and in Australia for a number of years. It's not an easy or a straightforward thing to negotiate, but I think it should be a top priority.
Kimberley?
Well, namaste, and I love India. So and partly that is because it's a pluralistic society. It's a democracy, obviously, but it's a great country, and I think I agree with James. We should not put our eggs in the same basket, and I think there's lots of people who are now discussing having relations with some of the Latin American countries in order to attract some of their students, for example, to come to Australia to engage in our tertiary education system, to the same point that we really don't want to have all of our eggs in the same basket.
I think that's a really important issue. Meanwhile, James, China's aggression under dictator Xi Jinping, it seems it's suddenly meeting a lot of resistance, or people are really, it's got people's backs up, particularly the riots in Hong Kong, obviously. How do you think that's going to end?
Well, I think it's a good thing, Andrew, that people around the world, but particularly in Australia and across the political spectrum, are taking a more realistic and more sober view of our relationship with China. I think most Australians understand now why we need to be very assertive and strong in speaking up for our sovereignty and our national interest and our values in the relationship with China. And I think that is driven by the evidence. Every day or every week we get further revelations, whether it's about the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, whether it's about Hong Kong, whether it's about Tibet or the Australian citizen Dr. Yang Hengjun who's detained there, that give us further reason to think very carefully about the relationship we have with China and the need for us to be vocal about our interests in that relationship.
And of course, Kimberley, there was a recent report a couple of days ago about China lying. It's still taking organs out of prisoners in a sort of forced donation.
Yes, I mean, that's a terribly troubling report. I mean, it's just something we would just never countenance here or in any, Western liberal democracy. I mean, it is inhumane, and it's a barbaric practice.
I think people have got to wake up a bit. But James, I say people should wake up a bit. Maybe one ABC host in particular, Virginia Trioli, should wake up. She attacked you yesterday for criticising China's appalling human rights. Some of the things we've mentioned, the arrest of Australian writer as well, installed in the South China Sea to our north, just to add to the problems. Here is Virginia Trioli saying that by criticising such things, you are actually the problem.
If you start describing China as an authoritarian foreign power when they're supposed to be our close trading partner, and when, as your Treasurer Josh Frydenberg says, we must manage our differences, you're actually part of the problem, aren't you? There's truth, and then there's just being critical for its own sake and also offensive of a foreign power that means a great deal to us. How about being a bit more discreet or a little bit more diplomatic?
James, did that line of questioning astonish you?
It's kind of you, Andrew, to offer me the opportunity to complain about a tough or even hostile interview I received, but I don't want to be seen to be complaining about that. I can hold my own with Virginia
It's not the
Trioli
hostility,
or any
James.
other journalist
I
at the
don't
ABC.
complain. I hold politicians to account too. I ask hostile questions. It's really the thoughts, the ideology that goes into asking those particular questions, that it is a shock and a shame and a scandal if a politician offends a dictatorship.
Well, one question, Andrew, that I did ask Virginia in return was what was inaccurate about the description of China as an authoritarian foreign power, and she didn't feel the need to respond to my question, as she's entitled not to. But I think that highlights the silliness of posing the questions in the way that she did. And I think the real question for people like Virginia in interviews like that is, which of the human rights issues that I've raised and that Andrew Hastie has raised should we not have raised? Should we be silent about the Uyghurs? Should we be silent about Hong Kong? Should we be silent about the Australian citizen who's detained there? Should we be silent about Tibet? I'd be very interested to know how she thinks it will be better for those people or for Australia if we said nothing at all.
Well, James doesn't want to sound like a whinger. What did you make of that line of questioning?
Well, I was so surprised that I actually went back to listen to the interview again, because I was very surprised. Now, her predecessor did use a debating technique to,
Devil's advocate.
take the opposite view to elicit more information. I don't feel it was that. And what I was reminded of, sort of in the opposite, was Secretary Pompeo's words when he was in Australia recently, which were, do you really want to sell your soul for a pile of soybeans? And I felt, it was actually to suggest that we should all be quiet, and I think the words she used were discreet, and we shouldn't really criticise anyone because, we're doing trade with that country. Isn't James part of the problem?
I guess I'm going to hear her stop banging out Donald Trump then.
But the point, it was a kind of a morally repugnant argument.
So.
And I thought it was also, I think I was also shocked because, of course, as a journalist, she should be encouraging people, if they do hold a view, to to speak the truth and to report upon that without, I think, making James and by extension I think Andrew Hastie these sort of people who were the problem, when in fact our society values and indeed celebrates the freedom of speech. It celebrates the right to express our views. The Voltairean principle, I disagree with what you say, but defend to the death your right to say it.
I'm a little bit upset that she disagrees with James criticising a Chinese dictatorship. I just find that, like you, I found it it's hard to be shocked now by the ABC. It's off the leash, but that was morally, as you say, morally repugnant. Just quickly, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg will tonight, James, give a speech saying he wants old Australians to retrain, work longer to help improve the national economy. I've got no plans to keep working longer and help the national economy. I'm going to be powering down in a year or so. Why should we work longer to help the economy? Shouldn't the economy be working to help us?
I'm sorry to hear that, Andrew. I thought you'd be continuing this show for many years to come. I was looking forward to joining you on it. But seriously, to respond to your question, I believe in personal choices for individuals. So if you want to retire early and you've got the means to support yourself to do so, then good luck to you. There's no obligation for you to work any longer than you wish. The issue that we have is that some Australians might want to retire early and expect others to support them, whether that's for their health costs, their retirement income or their aged care costs. And that's not sustainable. We can't have people retiring when they're healthy and young, but who are unwilling to support themselves to do so.
Kimberley?
Well, I think that, of course, there are some disciplines in our society where people gain a great deal of knowledge over their lifetime of work. And if they are able to work and they wish to continue and they enjoy it, much like you, I think you should keep doing what you're doing. And by extension, I think there are some people in our society who are able to do that. But I think we also have to be reasonable and fair that some people look forward to retirement because they don't have work like that.
Particularly people who labour with their hands.
Yes, absolutely.
Very quickly, I know you're going to Israel soon, very, very quickly. Donald Trump has just said they're changing the policy. Settlements in the contested West Bank of Israel will now no longer be considered by America as in breach of international law. Your reaction?
Well, I don't want to make foreign policy on the run, and I think we have a bipartisan position in Australia on a two-state solution. And those people who love and defend Israel don't want to get in the way of having any peace.
James Paterson, Kimberley Kitching, thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
More after the break.